Hi there, and welcome back to the Fuse Show. I'm joined by Verl Allen. Verl brings over 20 years of experience helping brands transform digitally, while at Ancestry, Omniture, and Adobe. During this time, he also helped accelerate the emergence and growth of SaaS applications within the enterprise space, while leading strategy and corporate development at Omniture and Adobe Experience Cloud. In 2018, he joined Claravine to address the emerging opportunity to support these same brands to address growing challenges of data quality that limits their ability to realize promised returns on their software and other digital investments. Today, he serves as their CEO and works along with hundreds of leading company brands like Claravine's Data Standards Cloud to address enterprise data integrity. Thanks for joining us on the show, Ver.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So, 20 years is a good amount of time in an industry. What would you say are like some of the key pillars of lessons you've learned and carried forward throughout those years?
Yeah, it's interesting. I started in this industry coming out of investment banking back in late 99. And what's been interesting to me is I start to see repetition in the problem. So one of the things I've learned is as problems are solved, almost like from a value chain perspective, as problems get solved, it's interesting how the industry cycles back to those problems as they become bottlenecks again in the future. So a problem that gets solved today and a lot of innovation happening around a certain problem today, that eventually will get solved, and then other problems will be getting solved. And as those other problems are solved, a lot of times it circles back to a similar problem. That's one thing I've seen is that kind of recurrence of kind of problems as solutions, and then ultimately they come back to a problem again. That's one thing. The other thing that's been interesting is just how much the industry has changed. Like, this whole evolution from the on-prem in the early 2000s and the shift to SaaS in the 2010s and to the 2020. And the other thing that's happening now that we're seeing, this is where we play really, and the big trend is the shift in from applications to data. You're seeing that a lot of enterprises have kind of maxed out, or you're getting to a point where there's point solutions. It seems like SaaS solutions for almost everything, and there's still a lot of innovation happening there, but a lot of the value is shifting now to dealing with the data that's being generated from this. So as I talked earlier about the problem shifting, it's again shifting from the app, going from on-prem. There's a whole bunch of value created by going into SaaS and the interconnectivity of that, and then the next kind of iteration of that is data. And that's really kind of what I see the big opportunity in the 2020s and going forward is around the data. It's the explosion of the data, a size of the data, and just this huge emergence of kind of cloud-based data technology and that kind of whole infrastructure that's now moved to the cloud. So
When you speak of when you speak of data, what's the thing that excites you about the most in the data space? Call it the next 5 to 10 years, based on your position.
yeah, I think the interesting thing that's happening on the data side, a couple things. One is it's a shift from collecting data and managing data to actually extracting value out of data. So as we shift from people making decisions to machines making decisions, that's a huge shift that you're seeing across the industry. And the challenge there is again, that's where we're focused, is on ensuring that you have enough data to make decisions off of. There's, data science, there's been a huge push towards a lot of people focusing on the algorithms and the models and tweaking those and getting a lot of value out of the tweaking of that. Now what they're shifting back to is saying, wait a second, there's a huge amount of value. I was just reading something today by an individual that talks about the huge amount of value that's available in actually increasing data quality and the size of the data set you're decisioning off of. So I think, one thing is just the speed at which we can process and access data and make decisions on data, and that closing that loop from collection to decision making, to optimization and analysis to decision making and implementation is shortening and shrinking. There's a bunch of stuff that's happening around process automation. There's a number of companies that are focusing on that sort of and using data to help automate processes that I think is going to be really interesting and shift the way people are working. So a lot of the kind of mundane, repetitive processes, a lot of that's going to be automated, and it's really going to shift towards the kind of the way the workforce is oriented to pushing people more into decision making and much more higher kind of order reasoning and problem solving. And again, there's a lot of that's going to be solved with machines, but there's still a lot of opportunity for people that have those skills going forward.
One of the things I think about when I think about data is I feel like, and correct me if this is, I guess, a limiting or limited worldview, but I think there's most companies that I've talked to face the problem of having too much data and not enough quality in that data. Like when I was at Uber, we logged so many different things, but the percentage of those that lead to actionable, meaningful decisions down the line, a very, very small fraction. And all that data still take up all the same amount of resources for compute, for storage, for like moving from place to place, for backups, etc.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth in that. There's a difference between data and insights and information, and I think you're right. There is a lot of in some situations people have to hold that data and manage that data for compliance and other sorts of reasons. But as you think about what data in the enterprise is really truly kind of directional signal that drives lifts or drives performance or optimization, it's becoming I think there's becoming much more better understanding of what that data is. And largely there's this whole emergence of kind of customer experience and a bunch of solutions around that. There's a lot of data that's coming through that, both that's generated through tags and other kind of automated collection, but there's a lot of that's coming from feedback from consumers and really kind of, as you think about brands building relationship with consumers, a lot of that's around collecting feedback and not just, it's not just the relationship itself, but it's the byproduct of that relationship, which is data. And so a lot of that is there's this whole emerging kind of market around customer experience that is really a huge source of either implicit or explicit type data, either customer given and generate directly from interaction with the customer, or a byproduct of kind of viewing the customer behavior and the customer actions across digital environments.
Can you walk me through how Claravine helps companies stay on top of the actionable pieces of data instead of getting lost in the large swaths of, I don't know, almost seemingly infinite, potentially non-actionable data?
Yeah, so really, and part of this is us helping organizations take data and making it more actionable. So we aren't in the business necessarily of building out a large kind of analytics infrastructure or BI or machine learning infrastructure. We actually power those applications, those systems to help them perform better. So the way I think about our solution is there's a bunch of points of data collection across, let's call it customer experience, for example, across the customer experience, whether it's marketing, whether it's sales, whether it's on the product side and engagement on the product side, where applications that are being used in the enterprise, like for the example, the average enterprise marketing organization has like 80 point solutions. There's some data that you can find out. There's a number of resources that you can find this out from. But what happens in those situations is none of those applications there's no standardization of the data models across those applications. A lot of them are point solutions or proprietary data sets. What we help provide is a standardization layer that sits in some ways in front of those. So if you're going to execute campaigns, you're building delivering experiences, there's a bunch of elements that go into that creation and delivery of that experience. And there's a lot of applications involved in the delivery of an experience. It's not just a single solution that's involved in that delivery or that creation and the delivery of that solution. And so we create a layer of data that standardizes and normalizes across all those applications. So as the data flows into whether it's Snowflake or some down or for machine learning or for running other projects, whether it's BI or analytics, we provide a set of, I'll call it metadata that accompanies that behavioral data or other data that's being collected, that creates almost a standardization layer across all the different systems that you're collecting and applications you're collecting data from. And so in some ways, we are a unifying layer, and there's a lot of people talk about ETL, which is kind of extracting the data, transforming the data, getting it ready, and then loading it back in so you can, for runtime. We kind of take the transformation out of that process. So one of the things that customers are using us for, and it's big companies, it's some of the largest shoe manufacturers and retailers and automobile manufacturers in the world use us cross verticals. And one of the things that they're finding is that eliminating a lot of that ETL, ensuring that the data is actually collected, because there's a lot of pre-flight and a lot of pre-collection insights we help deliver around are you actually going to be collecting the data you're thinking you're going to be collecting? So there's a lot of insight that we provide there pre-flight. And then there's also a lot of value we bring on the data cleanup side. So eliminating a lot of that ETL work that traditionally has happened so that it's not, and that's typically a people process and a lot of times, and helping kind of ensure cleaner data at the point of decisioning and analysis.
And are you doing that through a bunch of algorithms, through AI? What's your in-house like SaaS?
Yeah, so a lot of this is really, you think of it almost as much as it's a technology problem, it's a people problem. So if you think about one of these large companies, they have a lot of people internally that are doing marketing, they're doing advertising, that are doing a creation of creative. And they also have third parties, agencies, and other folks they work with. The challenge is that a lot of these organizations are using spreadsheets to capture a lot of data and insight about operational things that are happening in the organization ahead of, like, for example, a marketing campaign or the delivery of experiences. The challenge that you have is a lot of times there's no mechanism for onboarding that data into the data layer. And even if there's no consistency across all those groups and way to enforce that globally. So we really are an application that enforces and helps manage and govern data standards across the globe for these companies.
Gotcha.
And so that's the way to think about it. Is we are that kind of one. I was talking to somebody about this recently, his CTO at Deloitte, and he described it as, you guys are an application that provides data strategy that extends from the quants on the data side to the creatives and unifies them. And that's really kind of the way we think about it, because historically in the enterprise, data, when you talk about data quality, that's sort of been the realm of the data teams, the data engineering, the data science teams. People talk about 80% of a data scientist's job is cleaning up the data, and 20% is actually doing analysis. Well, we're trying to eliminate a lot of that data cleanup to allow a lot more time for analysis. And that's one of the big value props that we deliver to our customers.
When you think of customers, I imagine these are all generally large enterprises, but what's the ballpark of size of your ideal client?
We typically are focusing on I'll call it the global 5,000. So we have been really fortunate. It's interesting when we went to raise our Series A, and even when we raised our seed round, just looking at our customer lists, you kind of go through the Fortune 100, and it's very representative of the Fortune 500. You take a subset of that is really kind of where we're focusing, but extends down even below that, kind of the Fortune 5,000 is what I would call it, or the Global 5,000. It is the largest kind of brands across the world, and we typically are much more focused on those brands that are really kind of leading on kind of digital transformation and really focused on the creation of digital experiences and interactions with their customers. And that's becoming a growing part of their business. It's not necessarily, there's a lot of our customers that have brick and mortar as well, a big part of it. I'm thinking of some of the retail folks we work with. But digital is becoming an increasing part of that. And last year in the pandemic really kind of pushed everything forward dramatically on that front.
I think software enterprise sales is amongst the hardest, just because it's hardest to get your foot in the door. So how have you been able to crack that problem? I'm assuming not just for one, but many companies.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've been very fortunate. I've got a mature team that have come from, I'll call it a diverse set of large companies, software companies that sell into the enterprise. And for us, there's a couple of big things that we've been really fortunate to do. We've been able to establish relationships with a lot of the kind of systems integrators or like the Deloittes and the Accentures, those types of those and some of the large agencies that have consulting arms, like the Merkles and those sorts of companies. So that kind of group of companies and partners have been a great source of introductions for us and pipe creation. And largely it comes from the fact that they're in with these large companies involved in data projects. So they get in the middle there and they get into a project on the data side, and they start to realize that they've got an issue with data quality. And that's when they kind of turn to us and say, hey, can we bring you in to help? And it's kind of to solve their problem, but we end up solving really the problem for the brand, because they don't, they're not going to buy our technology. They're going to recommend the technology to to the brand, but it helps to accelerate the work that they're already doing in the enterprise. And largely those are being kind of driven by digital transformation projects that are underway. And so we're kind of inserting ourselves into that secular kind of shift that's happening in the enterprise. That's one way. The other way is that we see a lot of, we've been really fortunate because there's a lot of turnover in enterprise and especially marketing organizations. So it's kind of interesting. I was just talking to one of our folks this morning about, we're talking about pipeline creation, and we've seen a significant, as our customers have users that are shifting into other organizations, we get a lot of referrals. It's kind of crazy actually how much that happens, but we get pulled into organizations as somebody new ends up there. The other thing that's happening right now in the industry is there's a huge kind of shift in the way, if you think about the last 20 years in digital advertising, the currency on which $500 billion globally in digital advertising is transacted is, it's IDs, it's cookies, it's log files. With the changes with Apple with IDFA, some of the other changes they just announced yesterday, some of the changes that are coming down the pipe with Google and kind of third-party cookies being eliminated or turned off inside the browser, what we're seeing happen is that's a huge kind of shift around. The industry now is looking for a new currency on which to transact. And Google and others are talking about cohorts and segments, and it's a much more aggregated level on the way that you optimize. And that plays right into the way that we kind of have viewed the world from day one, which is we think about this as aggregated sets of data, and when you think about data standards naturally, it operates at a higher level, not down at the individual level, but more at a cohort or at a segment level. And so that's a whole shift. Just there's some industry stuff happening that also have been playing in our favor.
What's it?
So and in that vein, a lot of it's around content. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the types of content that we can create that help educate our customers or the industry more broadly. And that becomes a huge source of kind of interest and inbound demand.
Was content the means through which you're able to get your foot in the door with all these consulting firms? Is that how you got those, or did you have an established relationship of some kind with these companies?
It's interesting. It really varies. There's a number of situations where they've actually come to us on behalf of the brand saying, hey, we're in here in the middle of a consulting project and we're hitting a wall. Can you guys help us solve this? So some of it was out of need, them coming to us, hearing about us in varying ways. And, sometimes it's literally as a search. But in a lot of situations, they're talking to they've got teams and other brands that are saying, hey, wait a second, we know about Claravine and this, and this large, athletic shoe manufacturer or whatever. And so they're in all the big brands that we're in. And so what you start seeing is there's cross-pollination across those teams as they start to try and solve similar problems in different situations. We get pulled in. And it's striking to me how, with the scale of those companies, a lot of times they don't have normal interactions. It sort of becomes interactions out of need or desperation in some ways, where they hit walls in projects. The other part of it was we just had, our team had pre-existing relationships with some of these folks. And so it literally was, reaching back out and calling and leveraging the relationships we had with a lot of these teams and a lot of individuals, and just kind of using those relationships to kind of figure out a way into these organizations. The other big interesting part of that is with most of our customers, they're extending the use of our solution into agencies and other kind of service providers they're using. And so through the brands themselves that we already have as customers, they're working with the largest global ad agencies or the big systems integrators out there. And so they're users of our solution in brand A. In a lot of cases, they'll pull us in through those relationships into other brands.
For a lot of stories I've heard talking to other founders, it's the hardest client to land is client number one if you're trying to go enterprise. Can you walk me through the story of how you landed your first enterprise client?
Yeah, so I just to clarify, I did not start the company. I came into the company pre kind of a seed round of funding. So when I joined, the company had about 15 or 20 customers already, and some of them were pretty decent sized brands. The challenge back then was we were selling into like one use case into an analytics team, into a typically department in these companies. what was interesting to me was in 2018, just after I joined, we landed globally a very large athletic shoe manufacturer, the largest, and they were buying it on they saw the problem, and it was an introduction that was made to us by one of our partners. It was actually through Adobe. Adobe had come to the brand who they were already a customer of and said, "Hey, you guys, we can't help you solve that problem, but we think we know of somebody that can." And so in some ways it was them acting as a trusted advisor and bringing us in. We didn't have necessarily a pre-existing relationship with either one of them. And they brought us in simply out of the fact that they were trying to help the brand solve an adjacent problem to what they were solving. And it was interesting. Those sorts of introductions are really golden because you can't, in some ways, Adobe had already kind of come over and vetted what we were doing before they recommended us in. So there was a bunch of work they were doing with us. Once they saw what we were doing and validated that they thought we could solve their problem, then they were willing to make that introduction. But once that happened, the sales process actually went fairly smoothly because it was kind of a warm introduction. And I think if you can if you have existing relationships, those are the best ones to go to, because you know better than probably, the situation and the environment in that organization. Some of it may come down to understanding the technology stack and what they're actually, how they're architected, understanding what their needs are and what their current problems are they're focused on. Because a lot of this is timing, in the sense that if the brand, if what you're selling in or the solution you're providing isn't at the very top of the list from a pain point perspective, they'll get to it when they get to it. But it's always kind of, there's only a certain number of things that they can focus on and pain points they can solve at a certain time. And so if you don't hit that, very top of that, largely you're going to have to kind of sit in line and wait. And so having warm introductions like that is super, super helpful, because it's not just you describing the problem, it's the partner describing the problem, and they're setting you up with a very, very kind of deep understanding of the situation, the environment, who the players are, who the decision makers are, the procurement process. I think for us early on, the big challenge was just getting through procurement. It's when you're selling, you're selling into large enterprises. It's funny. I was talking to the same customer I was just mentioning, and they're out of in Oregon, and I remember going on site with them, and one of the things they told me the first time I came on site was, we don't buy software from startups. Just to be clear, we have no startup software in our stack. You guys are the only ones. And it was kind of like, don't screw it up. Because you screw it up, we'll just throw you out. So, it was, but it helps you from our perspective. That's really, that conversation early on when I joined here in 2018 was super helpful, because it instantly made me realize, and I kind of came back to the team and said, listen, when we think about who we are competing with, and when we're thinking about what the bar is we're trying to achieve from a usability perspective, from on all different ways you think about value, we're really competing against large enterprise companies, software companies like Salesforce and Adobe and Oracle and others, because those are the types of software solutions and the vendors that our customers are using. They're not using other startup technology. So that's not the bar and the hurdle that we have to clear. It's a much higher expectation that our customers have of how usable or how feature rich or all the type of support we have to be able to provide them. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for that type of an experience with us as a vendor.
So based on your experiences, can you tell me, I guess, a rough ballpark of the shortest sales cycle that you've had, the longest, and what a typical sales cycle might be in terms of length?
Yeah. So typically, our sales cycles are between a little over 5 months. That's our average. Okay. But we've had situations, the shortest sales cycles, to be honest, are upsell, cross-sell. I've had a situation where we had a customer recently that was, paying us about $50,000 a year in recurring revenue. And within, I think no less than that, it's about 2.5 weeks, we had a, $120,000 upsell on top of the 50. So, it's almost tripling the value over tripling the value of that contract in a very, very short time frame. But the work was done. I say it was 2.5 weeks from the kind of the creation of the opportunity to closing it, and that's a lot easier once you have paper in place. You have a MSA in place. It's easy to add SOs on, but that work really it's nice to say it was 2.5 weeks, but the reality is that we had been working with that customer for a year with it was the customer success team that really set that up for the sales team to come in and execute that and close that. We've had situations though on the other side where have sales engagements have gone well over a year. And some of those situations we get in and they don't have budget this year. And so the budget cycles are long in the enterprise in the sense of, you come in March and they're like, yeah, listen, we don't even actually plan. Everything's set for this year. We don't, and we're on a calendar year, they're on a calendar year cycle. So they start planning for the next year in July, and you have to get in that planning process for July, and then it's clear back to the next year before they even have the budget available. And then they go through the procurement process, which can last, I've been in procurement process that lasts 5-6 months just to get through procurement. And that to me is part of this is, as much as it is great salesmanship, some of it is just, you have to have a very high pain threshold sometimes, to get through these processes because they can be painful. And I've spent a lot of years, I do long distance, like road biking, and, I do 200 mile, I've done Leadville, it's a 100-mile mountain bike ride. And these are long, grueling rides where you kind of have to just gut it out. And that's sometimes the way it feels like with enterprise software sales, that these cycles can be long and there's a number of people that all of a sudden pop up halfway through the cycle, and it gets, it can get complicated. And, what I found is that we've been really fortunate to hire really talented, experienced reps, as sales account executives that are able to kind of help, that are very patient, high pain threshold, and are able to navigate these processes well and understand the questions to ask way early in the process way early in the sales process from what the actual close process looks like in the procurement process. And if you have people that are able to understand that early on, you can get through this very quickly. I mean, for us, probably the most painful processes have been trying to sell not to brands, but to sell to like agencies. So we've got a number of agencies that are very interested, and they're using our technology on behalf of brands, but a number of them have the problem inside their organization. They've come to us about buying for the organization. And those are painful because they don't really have the dollars. They're trying to buy it on behalf of the client. So it becomes this whole, they got to get the client on board, then they have to get on board. They get on board, they get the client on board, then they have to get on board. And so we went down that path for a period of time, and it just ended. It's just a really tough process to go through, and we'd much rather kind of sell direct or work with, systems integrators and those other folks that are much closer to the brands themselves and the decision makers up senior in the organization.
I'm familiar with in a lot of enterprise orgs, salespersons being heavily based on commission. Do you find it difficult to attract talent when the sales cycle gets too long? Because unless they're also staying for the same length, it's really hard to attribute that commission to them if it happens, call it like a year, maybe even 2 years from when they first reached out and built that relationship.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's very much a different sales mentality. There's, that's why I think you see a lot of, and it's tough going in and selling, $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 deals into enterprise, even today, because a lot of software sold in the enterprise today starts out as kind of single seat licenses that go then extend to departments and then extend to across the organization. It's a very different kind of bottoms up sales cycle. We typically, at this stage as a company, are going the other way, which is we tend to sell in kind of in the middle and upper ends of the organization, which make it a longer sales cycle. But what offsets some of that though is the size of deal. So as our deal size, we doubled our average deal size, or actually tripled our actual average new deal size in the last 14 months. Having that sort of offset and still continue to bring down sales cycles makes it much easier to retain talent, and having a base of customers that you can upsell and cross-sell into, and having retention rates that are well over, kind of net retention rates that are well over 100% allows you to really fill in more quickly sales for, sales into an account executive through that upsell cross. So it's not only a patch of new, but a patch of existing customers benefits. So I think having that mix, having both kind of upsell, cross sell, and new, make it much easier to kind of help ramp your account execs quicker.
Taking a step back into time, what made you jump from the private equity? Sorry, was it the you said investment banking industry into this relatively very different role?
It's kind of funny. I was in banking for about 3 years, and it was kind of one morning I had an epiphany, I'll be honest. Like, I was kind of reaching a point where prior to business school, I was more on the operating side, and then went back and then came out and went banking. And I came in one morning and kind of had this realization that the person in the organization, the managing director who I was aspiring to be, is a guy I just thought nobody likes. He's divorced. His family hates him. We hate him. And I'm like, why am I? And it was one of these mornings where he was just screaming at some people as I came in the office. And I kind of had this like, why am I aspiring to be that guy? Like, I hate that guy, and I don't want to be that guy. And I'm here. I'm aspiring to be that. And so I kind of took a step back and realized I love to build, and so it really was kind of that realization that, listen, I consider myself a builder. And when I left banking, I went to a 120 person startup called Ancestry, which is now well north of a $1 billion revenue company, and it was direct to consumer at the time, and it still is. And it was just so much to me. I came in there and I was like, okay, I found my happy place, because what I was able to do and the varied nature of what I was able to do and opportunities I had within that organization, much more. It felt just more like a natural fit for me, and it was a lot about building. And when when I came into an organization that had 5 people here at Claravine, you have to figure out how to create and how to build. And I think about when we hired our first. When I came in, we had one person on the payroll with an engineering title that refused to write code. Oh. And I was like, okay, this is interesting, because we were kind of outsourcing at the time everything we were doing back when I first joined, and I knew that we had to transition that, because there was all sorts of product issues that with scale as a company has scaled that we were going to have to address. And I remember kind of trying to figure out I'm not an engineer, I have a finance background, and so I was trying to figure out how do I ensure that I get the right people in here to solve this problem. And because if you don't get those first couple of hires right, you can literally go sideways and kind of not recover. And so what I did was I figured out I had to kind of be creative, and I went to a couple of friends that I knew that were working at another company much bigger than us. And it was a startup, but it was 300 or 400 people. And I kind of went to them and said, listen, I've got a bunch of flow right now from my venture. I've just closed a seed round of funding, and I have a bunch of flow on candidates for engineering hires. And so I went to them and said, listen, I'll make a deal with you guys. I'll interview them for cultural fit and other things. And there's I have enough technical kind of savvy to be a little bit dangerous. And then I will also then send them to you guys to interview, and I'll give you access to them as well. But what I ask for in return is that we have a conversation about each one of them. And if it's somebody you want to hire and your rationale for hiring them meets my criteria, then I'm going to make them an offer, and you guys are free to make them an offer as well. And then it becomes them self-selecting where they want to be. Do they want to be at a 400 or 500 person startup, or do they want to start to be hire number one? And that became, that's how I hired my first 2 engineers, was through that process. And, they're still here. So it's been a great, I kind of got lucky, but a lot of it was just leveraging some of those existing relationships I had within some other firms to make that happen. So some of that's just kind of, you have to be creative, and that's, investment banking doesn't lend itself to that, because you're so, it's a services organization, services industry, where you're really kind of, there's swim lanes you're swimming in, based on the client needs, and they don't, creativity is not necessarily always rewarded.
So do you have a new
So
new role model now that you're in the builder seat?
yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, there's a couple. It's interesting. I tend to I don't look at like Bezos or those. I don't look that direction. I look much more to people that are kind of closer than me, and there's some folks here locally that are kind of couple steps ahead of me, or that have gone through an exit and are now kind of doing something else and doing another, building another startup. And I tend to look to those people because they've been through it before and they've experienced it. One of my investors is a guy that I've known for probably, 12 or 14 years, clear back to when I was at Omniture prior to the acquisition of Omniture by Adobe. And he was at another venture firm back then, and then he left there and went operating. And so I knew him for a couple of years there, and then he went operating, and I kind of stayed in touch with him and he went through a slog. He eventually sold his business to Snap. But it was a slog for 7 or 8 years. And he left there and then he started his own venture firm, and we reconnected. He's someone that I look to because he's been on both sides. He's an investor now, but he's got so much empathy and compassion and really deep understanding of what this process and being in the seat, what it feels like. I mean, it's lonely at times, and he gets it. And it's funny because he will call me out of the blue, and it's in those moments where I feel like I really need somebody to talk to. And it seems like he kind of just knows when things are going certain directions because, he's fairly close to what's going on, and he'll reach out. And it's in those moments where I'm like, okay, he's always here at the perfect time for me. And having somebody like that as an investor that's got a vested interest in what you're doing, but also someone that has been in your seat and understands your situation really well, is super, super valuable. And it's hard to find.
So in addition to him, who are other people in your, I guess, like inner circle today that help you combat the loneliness? Because I think most founders experience loneliness because of the unique struggles they face that most other people they meet probably do not face unless they're also surrounded by other founders.
Yeah. I feel really fortunate. I got married about 2 years ago, and I'll be honest, my partner, she works at a startup, and it's a company that's gone from when she started there, I think there were about 60 people, and now about 800 people over the last 5.5 years. They've done really, really well. And she has, she came into the industry. She was in education for 17 years, left, and has kind of built a career over the last 7 years in this company and been quite successful. And one of the things that she is trained in is counseling and coaching in addition to her day job. And so she is someone that I look to a lot for advice. So I spend a lot of time sharing kind of challenges, and she is, the great thing about her is she's not trying to solve my problems. She's always asking questions. She's really kind of just pushing. She knows I have the answer. It's just a matter of sometimes pushing me to get to a point of coming to the answer on things. But also is just someone that having a part like that, having someone that's empathetic and listens, and is zero kind of judgment, but more just she's a executive coach by training, so she always is able to ask questions. The other person, there's a couple other people that I've worked with in the past at Adobe that I spend a lot of time talking to, and I typically touch base with them. It's usually about once a quarter or twice a quarter, and just kind of touch base and have continue to build and nurture those relationships. One of them was a guy I worked for when I was in corporate development at Adobe for a number of years, and his name's Taylor Berta. He's left Adobe now, and he's doing some other stuff, but he and I connect all the time and talk through kind of some of the challenges I'm dealing, struggling with, or kind of things going on. And he knows me so well because we worked together for 5 years that he's a great kind of sounding board and a great kind of person to bounce things off. And I'll be honest, like I have been really fortunate to have 2 other folks join me on my team that I knew before at Adobe. One came via an acquisition we did, and I got to know him there. And another one was there, but I didn't know him that well, and I got to know him afterwards. And having those 2 folks on my as part of my executive team has been super helpful because we get along in a way that I spent 10 years looking at companies and acquiring startups, and I've seen a lot of dysfunction in startups, a lot of drama. I've seen situations where there's a lot of drama, and I feel really fortunate. We don't have much drama here, and I have two. I'll call them. I don't want to call them co-founders, but two other folks. One who's my head of product, one who's my head of sales, who are just super valuable in this, not just because of what they do in their day-to-day jobs, but they're folks that we talk a lot of times at night, just catching up and chatting about not only things at work, but personal things. And so having folks like that you really trust makes a big difference to have them on your team. So there's people outside the company, but there's also people inside the company. And it's different things and different topics and different subjects that I talk about with both, because there's certain things that are happening inside that sometimes I can't always talk to the two of them about, but pretty much everything. We're pretty transparent. And then there's conversations that I can have. A lot of the conversations I have start outside, end up coming back in. And I find a way to kind of bring it back in and have those conversations internally.
Is your head of product and head of sales the two people you were talking about from Adobe?
Yeah, they were both at Adobe for a period of time. And the funny thing is, I didn't know them that well there. One came via an acquisition, and I got to know him a little bit there. And it's funny that his last day at Adobe, he and I ended up at a conference together in Boulder, Colorado. And I recognized him, and I'd met him a few times and interacted with him a few times. And we just happened to be at the same conference, and we sat down at a table together and spent the day just talking and chatting. And then 2 years later, I called him on my way to Leadville. I called him on the road and said, "Hey, do you want to come do this with me?" And he was at Oracle at the time, and it just happened that he's like, I've just actually been thinking about doing something else. And he was somebody that I had been thinking about all along for heading up product. And I reached out to a couple other people and asked them one question of knowing what I'm doing, two people I trusted really well. Knowing what I'm doing, who would you recommend I hire to head a product? And both of them gave me two people, and both of them gave me his name's Chris Comstock. Both of them gave me his name, and it just confirmed what I already knew. And so it was just a matter of kind of reaching out and figuring out if we could make it work, and which we were able to.
Is it fair to say that a lot of your closest confidants today came from serendipitous moments?
Yeah, I do. I think that, it's interesting. People that you go through the fire with, and people that you go through really kind of, trials, if you want to call it that, are really people that I think, and you see how people perform under fire, right? When things get tough, people kind of go different directions, and you really get a sense when things get tough, how people are going to react. And, I know how I'm going to react. But sometimes it's not about finding people that are going to react similar to you, but finding people that are going to help counterbalance how you might react in that situation. And so it becomes, I think it's really true. It's if you have a career where, and I see this a lot of times where I tell people all the time, be careful in the types of relationships you have. If you have a career that's built on transactional relationships, it's really hard in the future to call on people and call in favors or reach out to them for whatever, and have them have resources out there, or have advocates, if you want to call it that, in the market. And I feel really fortunate. I've really tried in my career not to have those types of relationships. I just don't have time for them, to be honest.
Right.
And it's those relationships that are kind of bidirectional and really symbiotic that I tend to nurture and build upon and value. And I've been able to call upon those. And I really, if you look at the company, it's a bunch of like-minded people. And so it's really interesting because it's not just me being able to call in on those relationships and leverage those and have them as advocates, but it's the team that I have around me has very similar kind of personalities and very similar characteristics around that and belief systems around that. And it's been interesting because it creates a lot of, I don't call it leverage, but it creates a lot of advocacy, if you want to call it that, for us.
Do you have any advice that you'd give to younger folk who are either early stage entrepreneurs or soon to be entrepreneurs about how to avoid those transactional interactions and have more deeper relationships? What are some habits that you picked up that you think really served you and your team? Yeah,
I mean, one thing I would say is, and I I came to be an entrepreneur much later in my career. My children were grown. I spent 13 years raising 3 kids by myself. And I came to the end of that a few years ago, and at almost 50 years old, and kind of came to the realization, listen, I'm a few years from retiring. Is that really what I want to do? And if not, what do I really want to do in this last kind of stage of my life? And that's why I made the switch. But one thing I would say is, I've seen it time and time again. This whole idea of transactional relationships is everyone, I see a lot of people, and it's in some ways advanced by you looked at LinkedIn and social media generally, and you go through I challenge people to go through their list of friends, and what you're going to see is there's half the people in there you don't really even know. And I'm not sure what in some ways there's value in that, trust me, but those are relationships. They are what they are. They're not real relationships. They're kind of pseudo relationships. But I think one of the things that I've found for me personally is I am not the type of person that carries a grudge. I remember at one point in my career, I was in a tough situation in a startup that we eventually sold to HP, but I was in a situation where I actually got fired. And the reason I got fired was it was a situation with some drama with the board, and it had nothing really to do with me. It had to do with the CMO at the time, who I worked for. They'd come in and decided they want to make a change. And then ultimately the founder decided, listen, they were friends. I don't really want to make the change. So he backed off. Well, the CMO assumed that I was the one trying to push him out, which was farthest from the truth. But what was interesting in that situation is, to this day, I saw that individual a couple months later, because we sat down and he's like, I don't trust you. He shoved me out, whatever, that's fine. It was fine because I already talked to I'd kind of been brought in by the venture guys, and they kind of already created somewhere for me to land. They knew what was going to happen. But I ran into him 2 months later. I remember seeing him across the room in a big event, and he saw me, and I could see he didn't want to talk. And at that point, I'm like, that's when I think you have that moment of like, what do I do here? Do I shy away, or do I just try and mend that fence? And so I walked up and just started talking to him and said, hey, listen, there's no hard feelings. And it would have been easier, I think, in that situation to be not, I guess part of his humility. I tried to be as humble in that situation as I can, and I have to force myself. It's not natural for me necessarily.
I don't think it's natural for anyone.
No, it's not. But in those situations, I think you have to make decisions like, am I going to carry a grudge here against this person? Or am I going to mend it? And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be your best friend, or they're going to, they want you to be their friend. But to me, it's just about leaving those relationships intact so that you can drop on them later. It's one that, to this day, I still run into that individual a few other times, and we've talked and everything's fine, but it's kind of like water under the bridge. And I think we have to make those decisions around, are we willing to put those things behind us and really kind of, I don't want to say forgive people, but in some ways you have to be, I think humility is a big part of it. You have to be humble. The other part of it is really taking interest in people. Do you really find people interesting, and do you really believe that people have unique things to bring to the table? One of the things I think I've learned through my career is you don't have to have all the answers. I think early in our careers, we think, we sometimes get caught in this cycle of, I've got to be prepared with all the answers, and we feel like we're being tested. And I think as we get more mature in our careers and a little bit, more confident, hopefully we start to realize, like, my job really isn't to have all the answers. My job is to facilitate an environment where the best answers can be brought up, where people aren't afraid to throw stuff out there that may be contrary to what I'm thinking, but are great ideas and great, and complement whatever solution we come up with. So I think that's another part of it, is having the ability to really take an interest in people and really value the opinions and the contributions of what people bring.
It's really cool to hear. Do you have like lessons that you've personally learned in the past, I don't know, call it 1 to 2 years, that you wish you knew 10 to 15 years ago?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think one of the things I've learned is everything takes way longer than we think it's going to take. I think we put, there's, what do they say, the best plans of, best laid plans always kind of go astray, but One thing I've learned is to be more patient. I think that's something I wish I knew years ago, because I think my tendency is to always push hard on things and really kind of try and drive to resolution quickly, which is not necessarily it's a bad thing, but there's times and places for that. I think that we have to be careful that we don't try and solve every problem the same way, which is let's quickly get to resolution and move on. Sometimes it takes a little bit more time for everybody to kind of get aligned and get comfortable with the decision that has to be made. That's one thing I think is learning to be a little bit more patient on some things. I tend to be pretty like direct and let's go. The other part of this I think is learning to have more empathy for people. I think that, as much as I said a minute ago, it's about valuing people and the relationships and the contributions. I don't think that I saw that earlier on in my career always, and really kind of I tended to kind of create a bar for people, and it was like you either cleared it or you didn't. And I think we have to be it's much more subtle than that. I think everybody's at a different stage of development and everybody is contributing in different ways. And I think you have to look at, you can't set the same bar for everybody. I think it has to be, you have to create allowances for people. And part of that is helping yourself become comfortable with learning what failure and what mistakes are, which is really their learning lessons, and their opportunities to learn and to grow and to develop. And it's not something you take personally. It's not something that it's, catastrophizing things. I think there's a tendency when I was younger to maybe catastrophize things like, oh my gosh, we screwed up, and the world's, you just go down this path of like, that's not really where it's going to end. It's going to end somewhere much less dramatic than that. I think that's one of the things I've learned a lot, is to kind of step back and go, okay, wait a second. We made a mistake. What did we learn from this? And how do we correct it? And because there's very few things out there, I think, in business that are lethal and kind of, I think we tend to make things sometimes worse than they are by our reaction.
So you mentioned this idea of like having, or at least formerly used to have this bar, people either cleared it or they didn't clear it. And now you're viewing it from a position of trying to identify strengths that may not be obvious at first sight. What about scenarios where someone just is not a good fit? Are you afraid you'd like retain them for too long? And what if they leave lasting damage in the organization?
Yeah, we just had a situation recently where we had this situation occur where we hired someone, and about a month in, Chris, who runs product for me, came to me and said, "Hey, I just don't think it's the right fit, and here's why." We walked through exactly what had been done, and it was about a little over a month in, and it's interesting because through the interview process, I interview everybody that we hire at this stage, and through the interview process, there was one or two things that occurred that were not red flags, but they were sort of yellowish. And we talked a little bit about it, and we decided, you know what? There's so many other things that are positive. Let's move forward. And as we looked back on it, Chris and I kind of sat down and talked about it, and we brought in a couple other people that were working to help train this person. It became clear relative to where we needed that person to be a little over a month in, it just wasn't happening. And so we had a decision to make, and the decision we made was to make a change. Like the amount of time it was taking from other people to help try and get this person up to speed and to train was just, it didn't seem like we were making the progress we needed for the contribution and the amount of time that we had committed to that. And so we literally a month in had to step back and say, you know what, this is not going to work, and have that hard conversation and make a change. And everybody talks about, fire fast, hire slow, or whatever. We tend to hire fast, but we also are very quick to look at where that person's really at from a development standpoint, and very quickly kind of set milestones of, are they meeting these milestones? And that's something we talk about ourselves. And we try to give as much latitude there as we can. And if it's situations where we have questions, then we try to double down as quick as we can to provide more resourcing to get them to where they need to, so we can make the decision quicker, either going to make it or not. And so it's those are always tough decisions, but the thing is that it's not a personal thing. This person, I think, would be a great fit in a lot of other organizations. It just wasn't the right fit here. And we tend to hire a lot for culture, like this whole idea I talked about with no drama, that we just don't tolerate drama. That's one thing that if we see it happening, it's just like and it's a recurring theme. It's just like that's how I think you can, those types of situations are really where you can start to erode culture and kind of erode trust with the employees. Because there are situations where when your people are coming to you saying, this person is this and this is happening, you hear it from multiple, you're like, okay, we got a problem here, because it's not just contained in this person. It's actually it's spreading across the organization.
So on top of,
And you try not to let it get to that level before you kind of make a move.
on top of avoiding or wanting to avoid drama as a part of company culture and keeping things, I guess, clean and smooth, what are some other things you really value as cultural components of your organization?
Yeah, one of the things we talk a lot about is checking our egos at the door. Like, I've been really fortunate to hire some I think are really talented, smart people, but there are people that are, how do I say this? There's not a lot of, sort of ego sort of to me sometimes lends into drama, but there's not a lot of, there's a lot of passion in what we do, I would say. Every day, people are very passionate about what we're doing. Our team is, but it's not necessarily a situation where the people have to be right, or it's not about always being right or always winning internally. We want to win externally, but ego is a big part of us being, this humble and teachable. These sorts of things, I think, are the opposites of ego. So that's another big part of how we think about one of the things we value is checking our egos at the door. The other side of that is, everybody talks about being customer centric. Like, we really focus on, one of the big metrics we focus on all the time is, and a lot of people do, is customer retention and customer satisfaction. So we're constantly doing customer NPS feedback in our application. And so we get a constant stream of that from customers. And if there are situations where NPS scores are low, we actually reach out to those users and have dialogue with them to really get to better understand. So it's trying to be proactive about that. So proactivity is another kind of value, like this whole customer centric and being very proactive on that side of things, because waiting and hoping things are going to get better is, to me, just it's not a great strategy. It usually doesn't. It usually gets worse before, you have to actually make it. It's up to us to make the situation better or fix the situation. It's not just going to fix itself in most cases. So those are kind of the proactivity, this checking our egos at the door are big things for us. And I think another part of this is, I'm always big on the fact that there's way more to do every day for us as an organization than there's time and people and resources to get it done. And so that lends itself to a couple of things. One is we talk more about sometimes the things we're not going to do, like get really clear on what the strategy is and what the objectives are. And then at least let's start with what we're not going to do. And then let's go to what, and a lot of times out of that discussion of what we're not going to do lends itself to what the natural byproduct of that is. What are the critical things we're going to go do? So a lot of times we'll start with what we're not going to do, because it's very easy, especially if you've come from larger organizations, to get hung up on we need to do all these things. But the reality is that half of those are going to add very little value, and it's or more than half, and it's usually a third of those things are going to be accomplished 70-80% of what you need to get done. So that's another big part of it when we think about how do we work each day.
I've really enjoyed this conversation, but at the same time, I also want to be respectful towards your time. So there's just one question I like to end all of my calls with, and that's, what's the best way for our viewers to get in touch with you if that's something they would like to do?
The best way is probably on LinkedIn. You can find me there. It's, just Verl, Verl, last name's Allen, pretty uncommon name. If you type in Verl, you'll probably find me. LinkedIn is probably the best way for people to contact me, and I'm pretty responsive there. And so that's typically the best way for people to get in contact with me.